the leader of the Scottish National Party and the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon.
She believes the SNP might hold the balance of power after this election. What would she demand? Well, there's two words writ large.
A vote for the SNP on December the 12th is a vote to escape Brexit. One in which,
if there is a hung parliament, Nicola Sturgeon's top ask of Jeremy Corbyn in what she calls an alliance, not a coalition, an independence referendum next year.
The SNP's message to any Westminster party seeking our support is this: if you cannot support this most fundamental of democratic principles, then the SNP cannot and will not support you.
Ms Sturgeon called Boris Johnson dangerous and unfit for office. But what of Jeremy Corbyn? Criticised by the chief rabbi over allegations of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party.
There is no place whatsoever for anti-Semitism in any shape or form or in any place whatsoever.
The chief rabbi has suggested that if Jeremy Corbyn became Prime Minister, the soul of our nation would be at stake. That decision may well come down to you. You could help Jeremy Corbyn into number 10. You could stop Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister. Why would you go against the warning of the chief rabbi on behalf of the majority of British Jews in exchange for an independence referendum?
Well, look, can I say firstly, I deplore Jeremy Corbyn's lack of leadership on the issue of anti-Semitism, and I do not condone in any way, shape or form that failure on the part of him and of the Labour Party to eradicate that from their ranks. We would be very clear of our expectations to any party leader who wanted the support of the SNP to make clear its zero-tolerance approach to anti-Semitism, to Islamophobia, to any form of prejudice and racism.
The SNP are also asking for more powers over immigration for Scotland, more powers over drugs policy to deal with the drugs crisis in Scotland, and scrapping the Trident nuclear missile system as soon as possible.
You know, it's been estimated that the renewal of the Trident nuclear weapons system could cost more than £200 billion. That is a colossal waste of money, and weapons of mass destruction are immoral.
Labour supports renewing Trident and says no early independence referendum if it forms a government. Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson like being stuck between the devil and the deep blue sea, says Nicola Sturgeon. But it is clear who she would pick.
Well, shortly after that manifesto launch, I sat down with Nicola Sturgeon in our third leader interview. I began by asking her which referendum she wanted to see happen first, the EU or Scottish independence.
I want to see an opportunity for the whole of the UK to escape Brexit, because I think it's a mess and I think it's a disaster and the wrong decision. But I'm not solely in charge of that, nor is it guaranteed that in a second EU referendum we get a different outcome. So we may yet again have Scotland vote to remain but be outvoted by the rest of the UK. So, you know, it's not quite answering your point about sequencing, because that is not entirely down to me, but the more fundamental choice for Scotland is, do we want to simply have our future determined by Westminster and have to cross our fingers and hope the right decisions are taken, or do we want to be in charge of our own future by choosing independence?
So that's clearly a priority. So if Labour wins and they have a second EU referendum within 6 months, would you ideally want to do an independence referendum before that? 2 referenda in a year.
The UK is in a mess, and you know, I guess the premise of your question is people, oh my God, that's terrible, but people in Scotland don't want to leave the EU. Increasing numbers of people in Scotland want independence. So, you know, democracy is the way to determine the kind of country you want to be. And now,
but Boris Johnson's right that 2 referenda in a year is feasible in your view.
But the alternative, well, it's feasible. The alternative to that is Boris Johnson ripping us out of the EU against our will, years and years more of trade discussions, more chaos, more uncertainty. That's the alternative to trying to plot a better way forward.
You have repeatedly this morning ruled out dealing with Boris Johnson. You have repeatedly not ruled out dealing with Jeremy Corbyn, a man the chief rabbi says is unfit for office.
I would rather Scotland was in the position of being able to choose our own government and get the governments we vote for, but we are part of the Westminster system right now. after this election, if there is a hung parliament and through the SNP Scotland holds the balance of power, we have to try to exercise that in the way that best reflects the interests of Scotland, obviously, but pursues and progressive policies.
But
now,
you clearly don't agree that Jeremy Corbyn is unfit for office.
Jeremy Corbyn would not be my choice as Prime Minister, but I don't get to choose who the leader of the Labour Party is. I would rather see somebody other than Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party. That's
Angela
not
Rayner?
my
Could
choice.
you tango with Angela Rayner?
Look, I don't know all of these people particularly well, so I'm not going to get into a sort of rundown of different names. The point I'm making, though, is I deplore Jeremy Corbyn's lack of leadership and anti-Semitism. He needs to get a grip of that. He should apologise. I can't understand why he doesn't. But people who are concerned about Jeremy Corbyn, well, firstly, if we're in this position, it's because he's managed to get enough support to be able potentially to form a government. But if you're concerned about him, better to have the progressive values of the SNP influencing the direction of that than have a Labour government without that.
You've said in your manifesto you want to end austerity, you want to end poverty faster, and yet the IFS analysis of your own Growth Commission report says that there'll be a decade more austerity if you had independence.
I've got a lot
That's
of respect.
not a price worth paying.
I've got a lot of respect for the IFS, but I think they are wrong about that because I actually don't think they took account of some of the things the Growth Commission said. The Growth Commission firstly recommended increases in public spending in an independent Scotland. It also talked about, in times of economic difficulty, the ability to have expansionary spending. But Scotland's deficit, you know, before I go on to that point, Scotland's deficit is a feature of the current Westminster system of government. So if it's a bad thing, it's not an argument for staying the same, it's an argument for change. But that deficit is reducing. If we had been having this conversation in the 2017 general election, you would have been quoting a figure to me that was almost 10% of GDP. It's now 7% and falling because our revenues are rising.
The whole pitch of your manifesto is about getting more power over your own destiny. So let's just look at some of the areas where you already have that power. You talk about protecting the NHS in the manifesto, but you're breaking your own law that all patients should begin receiving treatment within 12 weeks. Your waiting time targets, you're only hitting in 2 out of 8 categories. So you're in danger of breaking that manifesto promise even before the ink is dried.
Health services everywhere are facing the pressure of rising demand. Scotland is not immune from that. So as more people need healthcare, as the population ages, the demand on the NHS rises. But the difference in Scotland is the focus the Scottish Government is bringing to tackling that. We've got an £850 million waiting times improvement plan. If you read the most recent Audit Scotland overview report of the NHS, it says that in 7 out of the 8 key waiting times in the most recent year, more people were seen within the targets than had been the case in the previous year. Accident and emergency performance is way in advance of any of the other health services across the UK. So yes, these are big challenges, but the SNP government is confronting those challenges with record investment, record numbers of staff, reforms that haven't happened in the same timescales elsewhere in the UK, integrating health and social care, and we are starting to see the improvements of that.
But one area where you're absolutely not starting to see improvements, despite that extra money going in, is on life expectancy. So if you're a Glaswegian man, you have a lower life expectancy than a man in Algeria, Mexico, Iran, Jamaica. I mean, that's shameful, isn't it?
To lay that at the door only of the current government, I think, would be to misunderstand the roots of these issues. These are issues that go back
over a decade.
Sure, absolutely.
And that's not shifting.
But let me tell you what we are doing, because you said notwithstanding the investment, actually it's about more than investment in these things. So Scotland has issues with diet, alcohol, drugs, as obviously has been talked about a lot recently, going back a long, long time, decades in fact. What we have done in the time we've been in government, for example, and these things take time to work through, but if you take alcohol misuse, which is one of the factors in what you've just quoted to me there, we've become the first country in the world to introduce minimum unit pricing for alcohol. And in the time we've done that, the evidence we've had, it's too early to be definitive, the evidence that we have had shows that that's working.
You say in the manifesto you will support the WASPy women. Will you compensate them? Will you compensate them on the scale that Labour is proposing?
Well, you may not know this, but if you don't, you can go and have a look at it. The SNP commissioned a report actually not that long ago that looked at the different options of how this could be done, from the sort of full compensation that I think Labour are talking about through to how you could change the time scales that some of this was happening.
And you went for an £8 billion compensation scheme.
Well,
Labour says it will cost £58 billion.
Well, I think if you look at the paper of the SNP Commission, that option was there as well. I'm up for a discussion on how best to do this. What I'm not up for a discussion on is whether or not it should be done this. And I disagree with a lot of what Jeremy Corbyn says, but what he said on this is right. It's a moral issue. These are women who had an expectation of a pension that they had paid towards that have lost that, and that is not right, and it should be addressed.
First Minister, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, questions about the Union and Brexit aren't just swirling around here on the banks of the Clyde. They are, of course, big issues for people living in Northern Ireland too. So over now to John, who's in Belfast.
Now, it's being described here as one of the most volatile general elections in Northern Ireland in decades. Some have even gone so far as to call it a toxic campaign, with Brexit looming large. Pro-Remain parties are targeting the Democratic Unionist Party, who are trying to hold on to 10 of the 18 Westminster seats up for grabs here. But this election also comes nearly 3 years into a period without devolved government in Northern Ireland, and when public service, especially health service, face huge pressures. We will be debating the rising prospect of United Ireland later, but first, our Home Affairs correspondent Annie Davis reports on the election here in Northern Ireland.
It feels like a run into Christmas where storylines are blurred, between the gentle pre-lit build-up to one ritual and the volatile fluctuations of another. In Northern Ireland, where one party has reported threats to its staff and occasional unofficial campaign posters ooze old-style sectarianism, the season of goodwill has offered at times an unconvincing backdrop.
I can't recall a single election that has been as brutal in terms of the campaign, in terms of the smears, the lies, the disinformation, and the personal attacks that have been launched on candidates.
Previously, 17 of Northern Ireland's 18 seats went to the DUP or Sinn Féin. But Naomi Long's cross-community pro-Remain Alliance party surged in May's European elections, and with fewer here now identifying as British Unionist or Irish nationalist, the party senses shifting political sands, despite the rancour of the current campaign.
If your party espouses such a broad cross-community message, why is it that that broad appeal you say the Alliance has only delivered you one MP in almost 50 years, and that was only temporary?
Well, I think that there are a number of reasons, but I think the overriding one is the prevalence of the politics of fear. It is a very powerful tool that is ingrained in Northern Ireland society and psyche and has been for many, many years. But we also have an increasing number of young people who were born post the Good Friday Agreement, for whom that us and them, orange versus green politics, has no real meaning.
If Brexit has left politics in a state of deep flux, in some Northern Ireland seats, it's generating striking formations. Unusually, the SDLP and Sinn Féin, the two main rival nationalist parties, have helped create de facto pro-Remain pacts, aimed at ousting the Brexiteers of the DUP, but prompting claims it panders to old tribalism.
Do you have sympathy with those people who feel these de facto pacts are more about the politics of nationalism than the politics of Brexit?
Well, I understand where they're coming from, but they're wrong. And actually, people on the ground understand it. They're clever enough to know that whilst you may deploy different tactics in different constituencies, it's part of an overall strategy, and that strategy is very clear. Take out as many Brexiteers as we possibly can and put in as many Remainers.
He's just met a couple whose 3-year-old son Dahi is waiting for a heart transplant. Attempts to reform the organ donation system here have stalled. Across Northern Ireland, health workers take industrial action. Deteriorating waiting lists fuel a sense of crisis. And all the while, the devolved government meant to deal with this and other unresolved issues lies idle, having collapsed nearly 3 years ago.
I absolutely 100% am so invested in the institutions, and I believe in making them work.
In recent days, Sinn Féin and the DUP have been talking up hopes of sharing power again after the election. But it's how MPs here might use their seats in the event of another hung parliament, which is also attracting much comment. Sinn Féin rails against Brexit, but opponents say its policy of not sitting in Westminster is, at such a critical time, deeply flawed.
This decision on a critical issue is going to be made in Westminster, and your MPs won't be there.
Westminster haven't done anything for the past 2.5 years, only be involved in infighting in the Tory party. Ultimately, our interests aren't served there. We've used our influence, we've delivered on our promise to protect the Good Friday Agreement, to make sure there's no hard border in this island, to make sure that we protect our all-island economy. That's what's important to the people who live here. If the British people wish to leave the EU, good luck to them.
Across the political spectrum, the sense of interests ill-served abounds. For many in loyalism and unionism, Boris Johnson's Brexit deal is seen as creating a border in the Irish Sea, and thus comes saturated in deep resentment.
They have set a powder keg precedent, and they need to think about that, and the only way to think about that is take the Betrayal Act off the table.
Loyalist activists are staging meetings to oppose the deal, while some in unionism accuse the DUP, the largest unionist party, of enabling it.
There is disquiet, and it ranges on a scale from a small degree of disquiet to all the way to absolute fury about the fact that both the DUP and Boris Johnson, a Conservative and so-called Unionist Prime Minister, is looking to make Northern Ireland a place apart. This is probably the most important election of a generation. This is a question about making sure that we have enough seats returned into Westminster to stop Boris Johnson's withdrawal deal.
The pro-Brexit DUP reject accusations of complicity, reiterating how they voted against Boris Johnson's deal. But in Remain voting Northern Ireland, their eagerness to broaden the agenda is all too apparent.
This election is about more than Brexit in Northern Ireland. The issues that are coming up on the doorstep are the issues of health and education, the Assembly up and running, protecting Northern Ireland's place. Of course, Brexit is part of the debate, but it's not the main issue. People can revisit the referendum all they like, but that was 3 years ago. We're now where we are. We need to move forward, and the challenge is to get Brexit done in a way that guarantees and protects the union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That's what we're focused on.
And so the campaigns here move into the final weeks, drawn to the very issue which could yet have a profound impact in Northern Ireland, fought by those who could yet have a profound impact in Westminster.
Well, that's all from us in Glasgow. Let's go now to John in Belfast.
Well, welcome back to Belfast. You may be wondering what this great sort of purple splash is behind me. It is the Titanic Museum, and it is Titanic, although it is the most extraordinary colour. I haven't yet discovered why. Now, throughout this election, I've been travelling right across the United Kingdom, assessing the state of the Union, exploring how Brexit is exposing deep divisions in our politics and in our communities. This week, I've been here in Northern Ireland, crisscrossing political and geographical divides of this island, and asking how Brexit could see the story of our island's nations drastically rewritten.
So this is the family plot here, John.
In a border graveyard lies Ronnie, the brother of Ken Funston, one of the 3,500 people killed in the Troubles. He has lain here since he was murdered by the IRA in 1984. Are we in the Republic at the moment?
No, this is the north side.
I see.
The fields there are the Republic.
Yeah. His brother, Ken, a former soldier and policeman, drives us to where it happened on the family farm that straddles the border between Fermanagh in Northern Ireland and Donegal in the Republic. Gosh.
So the shed you can see straight ahead,
Yeah.
that was where my brother was murdered. Members of the IRA had crossed the Border River, which is about 300-400 metres away. Were hiding behind a hedge, and when he was feeding the cattle, they opened fire with automatic rifles and shot him in the back. My mother heard the shooting. She was at the farmhouse. She ran down and saw her son lying dead on the tractor and saw the two men run up the field with their rifles in the air, cheering their awful deed.
Ken's family was forced to abandon the farm. The memory of it all haunts him to this day. There are people talking quite openly about the possibility of a united Ireland. What does that make you feel?
Well, I mean, I class myself as a British person. I mean, from a young age, I joined the military. I joined the Royal Marines and moved away at 17. I joined the police, so I have put my adult life into supporting the British state. I think rather than constantly harping on about the border and how they can integrate Northern Ireland into an Irish state, we should look at a relationship an adult relationship we can have between the two countries.
What do we want? Irish unity! When do we want it? Now!
Ken speaks for many of his generation in the north, but calls for unity between north and south are growing. Here in Strabane, astride the border last Sunday, an amalgam of Republican groups demonstrate for unity. Its organisers say they want it to be a non-sectarian, inclusive movement for Irish unity.
The Ireland we're fighting for, what this movement is about, is for having working class people at its absolute centre and having the issues that affect young, working class, unionists, loyalists, Protestant men and women being part of shaping the Ireland that we want.
Further along the border, another farmer, like Ken Funston, a unionist, but one who, in a groundbreaking election, became the first Protestant from Northern Ireland ever to be elected to the Irish Senate in Dublin.
We've become accustomed now to seamless, frictionless trade and movement of people and goods and services north and south, so I think certainly it is symbolic of changing times.
He doesn't rule out unity on the island of Ireland in his lifetime.
I've had coffee and shared coffee with loyalist paramilitaries who've told me that they're very proud Irishmen, and I was surprised, I was taken aback by that. And when it was explained to me that the reason they joined the paramilitaries wasn't because of their Britishness per se, it was actually because their friends and family were being murdered. And the interesting flip side of that is when I talk to Republicans, very often it's exactly the same reasons. Personal issues, protecting friends and family with the motivation. So it's a very, very complicated picture. The tapestry in Northern Ireland is very, very complicated.
The gradual coming together of communities has benefited Northern Ireland's industry, but old certainties are fast being shredded by the uncertainties surrounding Brexit.
Brexit has destabilised all that was stable here for the last half a generation, the last 20 years. The types of conversations that are taking place now about Northern Ireland's position in the Union or Northern Ireland uniting with the rest of the island of Ireland, those are conversations that haven't taken place here for a long while. What was settled has been unsettled, and this community has been unsettled with it, including the business community.
At a student bar in Belfast, we found a marked air of indifference amongst some and a sense of betrayal amongst others.
I wouldn't like to think the British that would let us go, Northern Ireland would let us go for all we fought for. I wouldn't like to think that they'd just let us go over a deal that they become better rather than taking us with them. That they see us as a weak point, but we're not a weak point. We fought to become a part of Britain. We fought for the Queen, the King, whatever. And I just believe that if there was a United Ireland, there'll be a lot of change and there'll be a lot of blood on the English hands.
The minute, I think we're stronger together. I think we're stronger in the Union. But if United Ireland came along and it was stronger, then I would be favoured to that. But it's whatever's going to give us more money.
On my list, I don't think it's right now it's a priority. I think the health service needs sorted out, climate change.
Yeah, I completely agree with Johnny. Like education, health service, everything's just more important at the minute.
It does not affect me. I couldn't care less about the border, to be honest. As long as everyone is getting education, we've all got our benefits, like all of the stuff that we need. I don't see any issue.
For a perspective from the Irish side of the border, we travelled to Dundalk to meet the writer and thinker Fintan O'Toole, who for the first time thinks unity between North and South will happen in his lifetime.
People in nationalist Ireland, you know, in the south and nationalists in the north, had a story which was you were eventually going to get United Ireland because of the things that Irish people were doing. It's actually more likely to happen because of what English people are doing. You know, English nationalism is going to be the big force in reshaping the architecture of these islands. So we're being pushed, I think, much more rapidly towards having to think about what the end game here is. What does it look like if the Union breaks up? And we're left with over 1 million people on the islands of Ireland who still have a very passionate and legitimate sense that they are British and that they want to be part of that. So I think we really need this conversation now, and we need it to be as generous and open as we possibly can make it, you know, where it's really about thinking about, well, we're going to have to share this island. This is a space we share. We've been doing that in real ways over the last 20 years, you know, much, much more so than we've ever done before. What would the politics of that look like?
Fintan O'Toole sees Brexit as a force of English nationalism, but did any of its instigators ever give a thought as to what it might do to the island of Ireland? Well, with me now is Sarah Canning, whose partner, journalist Lyra McKee, was murdered by dissident Republicans, the new IRA, in April this year. And the political editor of the Unionist Belfast newsletter, Sam McBride. Sam McBride, the DUP, which is the group of MPs, 10 of them, who propped up the Tory government in the last government, they miscalculated, didn't they? Not done them no good whatever.
I think it's very clear in retrospect that they miscalculated. I think it's also very clear in retrospect when I talk to people in the DUP, when other people talk to senior people in the DUP who were involved in that decision to back Brexit, that it was taken casually. They did not expect Brexit to happen. They backed it almost on a whim. It was a new leader, Arlene Foster. She didn't feel like she had the authority to say, we are perhaps going to sit this one out. She could never back Remain because of her party's history, very Eurosceptic party, but she could have sat on the fence, and that was something she decided early on not to do. That was a strategic miscalculation.
Well, could they even now change horses and actually back Remain?
So the logic of their position, where they say the union that matters to them most is the British Union, it's not the European Union, regardless of their views on that, is that they will back Remain if the only choice is between Remain or Boris Johnson's deal or a similar deal which damages, as they see it, the union. However, even at this point, they're not saying that publicly.
Sarah, you come from the nationalist tradition. Do you think you'll ever see United Ireland in your lifetime?
It was something that I would never have expected to see before now. I'm still sceptical of whether or not it would ever come about in my lifetime, but I do think that we're heading towards a border poll at some point.
What would your answer to that be, Sam?
I think that we are headed towards a border poll, and that was unthinkable before Brexit. It was unthinkable before the collapse of Stormont. It was unthinkable before the Cash for Ash scandal. So there are a series of events which have pushed us towards this precipice. And as one of the guests in that package said, we have gone from a position of certainty. Whether people liked it or not, there was certainty. There was record levels of support for the Union in Northern Ireland just 4 years ago. Suddenly, everything is up in the air.
Been announced this very day that there are going to be talks to restore Stormont, local administration for the whole of the province, as soon as the election's over, days after it finishes. Do you believe them?
I think there will be talks, and I don't think it's any coincidence that these talks and the seeming renewed enthusiasm of the DUP for talks and getting back into Stormont comes as their influence at Westminster potentially is slipping away. They have had significant influence there. Now they realise that if they don't have their hand on the lever of power somewhere, they're really quite exposed in this situation.
Do you really want Stormont back? I mean, things seem to be in a most terrible mess here.
Yeah, I think Stormont coming back is something that is necessary for Northern Ireland to progress. At the minute we're looking at an education system that is in a shambles. Our health service, which is across the board in the UK, is suffering, and without an executive to legislate and to put packages in place and to set budgets, we can't move forward. So it is a necessary step. I just would rather it didn't take us back a step from the legislation that we've had passed through essentially direct rule.
I began my report tonight with that murder which occurred in 1984, and it makes one wonder, when your own dear partner was murdered, did you think that was perhaps the beginning of another cascade of killing?
There was a part of me that was afraid of it for a while, and I mean, it's still very possible. These people seem to think that murder is what has gotten us to a place of peace and to the place where we have been for the last 21 years, where things have significantly improved, and Northern Ireland has been a much better place to live. Certainly not perfect, but it's something that needs to be taken off the table. Violence is never the answer.
Sam, travelling around the province, I've been really affected by the way in which people seem to be becoming more fluid in their views. And in fact, my sense is that it's Brexit that has actually unlocked them, that people are now scrambling for new ideas and new positions.
I think Brexit is the single biggest issue that has changed things there, but I think that over the last 20 years or more, since the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, there is a new generation of people in Northern Ireland who have never known serious violence of the sort that we saw during the Troubles, and those people are more malleable in most cases in their views than their fathers or their mothers or their grandmothers or their grandparents, and those are the people who will decide Northern Ireland's future. And if there is a border poll, I think the interesting thing will be, is there for the first time in the history of Northern Ireland a swing voter, people who might go to either side? That has never happened. People don't move from the DUP to Sinn Féin. Maybe now they will.
Those young people that I spoke to, the students, that some of them really were driven by completely different issues: climate change, health, education, all the things you've mentioned.
Yeah.
Is it possible that this is being sort of de-religiosised, de-politicised almost into new issues?
I think so. I think we're becoming a much more secular state. We're not as driven by the orange and green. There's a whole section in the middle who have very little representation, and that's what they're crying out for. And I think the youth of today are so much more focused on the future and building a good future for themselves.
You're a seasoned observer. Do you see a big change?
We are certainly becoming much more secular. However, I think it has to be said that even during the Troubles, it was mistaken in many cases as being about religion. A lot of the people then and now who are most tribal, most hardline on both sides, they're not terribly religious.
Sam McBride, Sarah Canning, thank you both very warmly on a very cold night for being here.